on a day like today, you have to think cool thoughts. Or stay in air conditioning. But today, we have to think cool thoughts. And we're looking at the book of Jude. We are looking at verses 5 through 7. And these three verses break down into a 3-verse outline. And they break down like this: the unbelieving Israel and what happened to them, the fallen angels and what happened to them, and Sodom and Gomorrah and what happened to them. And all three of these examples, these three verses, are examples of rebellion against God. And so Jude writes in verse 5, "Now I want to remind you, though you know all these things, the Lord first saved a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe." So Jude first starts out, he reminds the hearers, the readers of this book, and that you know all these things. He's talking about the Exodus out of Egypt of the Israelite people. And the Lord saved them out of Egypt, but he later destroyed those who did not believe. They had to wander 40 years in the wilderness. And the reason they wandered in the 40 years was because of unbelief. And the reason they wandered for 40 years is so that the generations that did not believe could die out, and God would bring up the new generation, the children, into a generation of believers. And so this is a teaching that Israel had heard previously. And see, what he's saying, in the same way, we will be held responsible for the teaching we've heard. And we find a similar teaching over in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, which we'll look at. It uses similar language. It's very close to this, and we will look at that. It's like when you were in school, the teacher would tell you, this will be on the test. Study this. And if you did not study that when you were in school, you would end up failing the test. And most teachers only put things on the test that they've taught or told the class to read. And in a similar way, though this isn't a test, Jude is saying, look, this is what you've been taught. You are responsible for knowing this because you have heard this. And so the teaching that we find here, the teaching that we find elsewhere in the Bible, is authoritative. The apostles at this time were beginning to be martyred. They were beginning to be killed for their faith. And at the same time as they were being killed, false teachers and false apostles were rising up in the church, and they were like wolves in sheep's clothing. The Apostle Paul mentions this over in Acts 20, verses 29 through 30. "I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And men will rise up from your own number with deviant doctrines to lure the disciples into following them." So here's Jude. He's reminding us about this story about the Israelite slaves. They were being rescued, but they also rebelled. They also adopted false doctrine. And because of their unbelief, God destroyed the unbelievers. And so Jude is warning us. He says, look, do not fall into unbelief. Do not fall into the same patterns. Don't tolerate false teaching. Why? Because God does not tolerate false teaching. And God punishes it. Verse 5 is the number one example, the first example of what happens when there is unbelief and God says he doesn't tolerate it. And then Jude tells us about the punishment of the angels in verse 6 who rebelled. And he has kept, God has kept, with eternal chains in darkness for the judgment of the great day, the angels who did not keep their own position, but deserted their proper dwelling. So verse 6 is giving us an example of the angels who left their position. We're not quite sure what the position was, but they did not stay there. And they rebelled against God. God, who was their creator. We see a glimpse of some of this rebellion from Genesis chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 14 tells us the story of Lucifer, Satan's rebellion. We find a glimpse of it in Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, before the start of the war of heaven, the beginning of which begins in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7. But Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, refers to the sons of God, the angels, and the daughters of men. And if you look at it, there's not always agreement on exactly what is happening here. But at face value of the reading, it seems to indicate, and it fits logically, to back that up, that the angels rebelled, came to earth, and had relations with the daughters of men. And in the Old Testament, when you see the term sons of God, it always refers to the angels. Find that in Job chapter 1, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 38, verse 7. And so because of that rebellion, God's response was to imprison them or to keep in eternal chains the fallen angels who had committed this sin, so that the other angels would see this example and not do the same thing. Which is what we see here in verse 6. This is an example for us not to rebel against God. Over in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment." And what this is saying, if the angels were subject to God's judgment, in the same way we will be also. But God has provided a way to avoid punishment if we follow the parameters that God has set up. The angels disobeyed God's law, and when we don't do what God would like us to do, what He has asked us to do, then we have a problem. And right here, in verse 5 and verse 6, we have two clear examples of what happens, and then over in verse 7, we have another example of rebellion against God. Jude verse 7, in the same way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them committed sexual immorality and practiced perversions, just as the angels did, and served as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. Verse 7 ties what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah and the sexual immorality and the practiced perversions with rebellion against God. We live in a society now that does not recognize God, that has unbelief. God calls unbelief rebellion. And so we have these three clear examples of what God does when there is rebellion. So what makes us think that we are going to be any different from these examples found here in Jude? A while back, there were these old television commercials. You may remember seeing them, or you may have heard them for Fram oil filters. And the tagline was, "You can pay me now, or you can pay me later." Here's one of the old commercials.
That's me. I know it. When an engine needs a rebuild, I bring it to Joe. That's me. And you know what he's rebuilding a lot more of these days? 4-cylinder engines. Small engines work a lot harder than big engines, so if you have a small car, it's even more important to take care of it right. Change the oil regularly, and put in a new Fram oil filter when you're supposed to. A Fram filter doesn't cost much. I do. But the choice is yours. You can pay me now, or pay me later.
And so there is a life lesson here for us in that commercial. We have a choice, and every choice that we make has a cost to it. One choice, the cost, everything has been paid for us. We owe no debt because the cost, the penalty, the debt has been paid for us. You can follow Christ and obey God, and everything is taken care of. The cost is paid for. All we have to do is accept what Christ says and follow Him. That is the way that God created us. Or we can pay later and we can do our own thing. And that's what a lot of people nowadays do. They do their own thing. See, when Jude and the other writers of the New Testament, they were anticipating the return of Jesus. But they also knew that the return of Christ might be delayed. That the parousia, the second coming, theological term for the second coming of Christ, the parousia, might be delayed. And so they said, and set the example for us that we are to use the Bible to guide us in living the Christian life. So when we read the Bible, we should see it in two ways. There is the now and the not yet. When we read it, we should see the now part. There is still a part to come when we read the Bible. But when we first look at it, there are things that we need to be doing. There are things that we need to be changing about ourselves. There are warnings about things that we should be looking out for, that we should not be doing. Things that could hurt us. The Bible warns us that Satan prowls around like a roaring lion. The Bible says, be aware of that. Watch out for Satan as a roaring lion. And then there are parts, when we read the Bible, there are parts of it that are going to take place in the future, such as Revelation. There's the war in the heavens. There's the 1,000-year reign of Christ. There's all kinds of things that are still to come. There are prophecies in the Bible that God has said will happen in the future. And we must be ready for them. So we need to have an air of expectation when we read the Bible. We need to begin each day with the thought that perhaps today could be the day that Christ returns. And I believe that there are probably some here today that may see the return of Christ. And at the same time, we know that everybody dies. And so we need to be ready for that. The Bible tells us that there is a literal heaven and there is a literal hell. And there are already angels chained up, awaiting the final judgment that is to come. The angels were separated from God, and because of sin, we are separated from God. So we have a choice: obey God or continue on our own path. It comes back to, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. The pay me now is that Christ has paid our penalty, the debt that we owe to God because of our sin and rebellion has been paid by Christ. All we have to do is accept what Christ has done for us. Or we can go our own way and pay later. But God has made it clear that in the future there will be a coming judgment. And that judgment will affect each one of us. The Bible tells us in Romans chapter 14, verses 11 through 12, For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me, and every tongue will give praise to God. Every knee, every tongue will give praise to God. And then it says, so then each one of us will give an account of himself or herself to God. So there is judgment coming. There is something coming that God has so very clearly told us in His Word. It could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be many years in the future, but Jude is teaching us that God asks for belief. And He has provided the means for us to believe and to accept His grace and mercy and love. But if we choose not to, there will be punishment in the future. So I ask you, have you made the choice to follow Jesus and accept His grace and mercy? Or are you determined to find your own path, to find your own way in the world? These 3 verses very clearly show us what happens on whichever road that we choose to take. If we choose the road towards rebellion, God will and does act. It may not be today and it may not be tomorrow, but it will be one day. Sadly, many today are choosing the road of their own way, their own path. And I pray that none of us will be ones that choose that path. Because as Jude so clearly shows us, God has to provide an answer to that. And God does provide an answer to that. Amen.